Well, there's many questions today still on NSA leaker Edward Snowden and how he's being portrayed, because how he's being portrayed really will help us determine the accuracy of the story that follows about the consequences for his actions. Is he a spy? Is he a source? Is he something else? He's believed to still be in the Moscow airport right now, so he's in the transit area apparently with no passport and no visa, but certainly still a lot to talk about. Andy McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor who prosecuted the Blind Sheikh, of course, a known terrorist, First World Trade Center bombing, and you're the perfect person to talk about this with, Andy, because there seems to be a little bit of media guilt about how we're talking about this guy. Is he a spy? Is he a source? Is he something entirely different? Because that word matters. It determines an entire tone of a conversation. So what should we be calling this guy?
Well, you know, he actually is different things to different people, and depending on you know, which perspective you want to look at him in. And a lot of that is intentional. I mean, you know, for example, in wartime, we have the capacity to treat people, if they're the enemy, as military enemies or as criminal defendants. That's supposed to give more options to us rather than give them, you know, rights to play off against each other. But somebody can be a spy and a source and a defendant.
But you bring up something interesting. It is a wartime. People may argue that depending on what Congress has determined about the Iraq War, or Afghanistan, or anything like that. But we talk about this time in our country as a time where we are still very much at war. How does that factor into how we're dealing with someone that is spilling our national secrets?
Well, it's not just a rhetorical war. The war is actually taking place under an authorization of military force that Congress enacted in 2001. And functionally, that's a declaration of war against enemy combatants as Congress has identified them, both in that authorization and in some statutes they've passed since then. I don't think Snowden fits into that box.
Why?
Well, they've defined the enemy basically as those groups, countries, or individuals who carried out the 9/11 attacks or harbored those people afterwards. So Al-Qaeda, for example, fits, but I don't think Snowden does.
But we are hearing now, according to sources telling our Catherine Herridge and others, that Al-Qaeda is being helped by the information that Snowden leaked. Does that change things?
Well, Al-Qaeda, it really depends on whether he intended to help them or not. And that gets you into kind of a legal quagmire that I imagine the
we can avoid
not to be in.
We'll avoid the quagmire. But one of the great things that you've discussed a lot as a columnist is what justice means in this country and how we go after people that are our enemies.
Right.
I was throwing around this term enemy of the state, right? I think it's a movie or book or something like that. It's a political term. It's not a legal term. But some have suggested that Snowden fits into that category because he's doing the country harm. And the follow-through on that and how we handle it, what do you think are the repercussions of it?
Well, it really depends on how they decide to go after him, and it's not like they have to make one decision. They have to use the criminal justice track because pretty much the only way you can get a country to extradite somebody, assuming we can get one of these countries to do that, is to file criminal charges. You have to have those on file. And there's a variety of them that apply to what he's done. So, yes, he's probably guilty under the Espionage Act. He may also be guilty of treason, but treason is a much more complicated thing to prove than espionage.
So right now it's a law enforcement matter. Is that a general term to use for it?
Well, I think within the law enforcement community, they're certainly considering it that, and I would think the State Department is as well, because to the extent that they're involved in the extradition process, you have to have those charges on file. And usually in an extradition case, you have to have them on file early, because there's always a question whether once you get the guy here, whether you can add new charges.
Interesting. It seems that, and you've certainly been witness to this over the last few decades, that the way that we're using laws to go after people that are a threat to our national security has changed. How different would the situation be if this was World War II?
You know, that's a great question, because I think we were much more politics-driven than law-driven during World War II. So, for example, we captured Nazi saboteurs, one of whom was an American citizen in 1942.
And justice was quick for that individual.
Yeah, and FDR, probably against Supreme Court precedent, designated them as enemy combatants and had them executed after a trial within 7 weeks of capture. And there was some question at the time whether that was constitutional or not, but the Supreme Court decided that it was.
Quick thought, because that's such a contrast to what our president said today. Listen, I'm not going after this guy. He's a 29-year-old hacker. I'm not going to wheel and deal for this kid. Like, you know, I'm not going to engage. That's so different than the actions that you say would be of a politically driven president like Roosevelt. What just your thoughts on that message and what that message sends to the world?
You know, I don't want to seem like I'm always going out of my way to criticize the president, but, you know, we had 19 people who brought us to war because we didn't engage seriously enough on the kind of counterterrorism we should have been doing. With that experience to guide us, I really find it strange that you could take the position that someone who could be causing profound national security problems to us in wartime while we have troops in harm's way could be so cavalier about that. I just don't get that.
There's so many different streams of thought and a lot of confusion around this, which is why we wanted to talk about the words, the consequences, and why they matter. Andy, thank you.
Thank
you. It's always
you.
nice to have these conversations with you. Rick?
Well,